A century ago, they said that if God had intended man to fly, he'd have given him wings. 40 years ago, they said that man couldn't fly faster than the speed of sound. In the 1950s, they said that man couldn't live in outer space, but he did. They said if man landed on the moon, he'd be swallowed up in a sea of sounds, but he wasn't. Today in our studio, we've a man who claims he has the technology to build a machine which would take us to Tokyo in 30 minutes, to the moon in 9 hours, and the beauty of it is that it doesn't need any fuel. Science fact or science fiction? What does our audience think? Well, audience, I'm going to ask you now, on that basis of evidence, do you think that in the 21st century man would be able to go to the moon in that kind of speed, 9 hours, simply as a result of magnetic power? Now, will you put your hand up if you think he will be able to? Anybody there? Did you hear me correctly? You did, and you don't think that's the case. Well, that will interest, though I suspect not surprise, John Searl, who is the inventor of this amazing piece of equipment. John, you're not a scientist, but you've worked for many years at the Midlands Electricity Board, and you reckoned you've sussed out this kind of thing. But does the reaction of our audience today surprise you?
No.
You're used to this kind of reaction?
Used to it, yes.
Why do you think people don't believe it?
Well, they never believed the motor car was coming, or the train, or the aircraft. So why should they believe about this?
Well, let's see if we can convince them. Right next to you is a model, a BBC model, it has to be said, not your own model. Just explain to us, if you can, for a real thicko like me, how it really works.
Well, basically, it's 3 plates, magnetic plates going around near the circle. There are a series of runners, and these magnetic runners operate at minimum 200 miles an hour. And it is the energy that's been produced by their speed that lifts the craft, because it cools the surrounding atmosphere and improves the actual power that it can handle.
So you've actually flown this thing, you've proved it can fly?
Oh yes, we've had 40 models since 1946 to the present, well, the last 5 years before everything was destroyed.
And is it still controllable? You've got a little control panel with which you control it?
Yes, well, it's a big control panel actually.
Now, you know, not only space sort of claimed your craft, fire also seems to have claimed it. You had a rather nasty accident with all your papers and your models. What happened?
Well, it's a question that somebody never liked the progress I was making, and they put pay to everything with the hope of stopping the work I was doing before it went any further, because I was almost ready to launch the last and final craft that was to be televised.
So it all went up in smoke?
Yes, and we're now restarting, rebuilding again.
But you've still got, personally, the technology which will get you to that stage,
oh, yes, I've got to recalculate everything again. And this we are actually doing at this time.
Well, you've had a lot of sceptical reception from the world of science. We've got a scientist with us today. We've got Dr. Stephen Donnelly, who is a physicist. Dr. Donnelly, what do you make of John's claims?
Well, I hate to be boring and predictable, but I'm highly sceptical.
But, I mean, aren't scientists always sceptical of things like this? You know, I mean, you would come along and say that, wouldn't you? Because science, as you know, it hasn't discovered it.
Well, that's right. And if, in fact, one of these machines was now hovering at a foot above the ground in front of us, not only would I cease to be sceptical, I'd offer Mr. Searl a few quid and try to get a piece of the action, I think.
So you're even questioning the veracity of Mr. Searl's claims, then, that he's got it off the ground?
No, I'm not. I think dealing with a claim like this, there are 3 possibilities. One possibility is that it is a whole tissue of lies, and having met Mr. Searl, I don't believe that for a minute. The other possibility is that it completely turns physics on its head. Now, physics doesn't do a bad job of putting satellites into orbit and generally making our technological world go round. Before I'd be prepared to do that, I think I'd have to have more than a BBC model and a couple of black and white photographs. The third possibility is that Mr. Searl has come up with some interesting discoveries that in fact are rediscoveries of well-known physical phenomena. And looking at his machine, I couldn't help being struck by the similarity between the underside of Mr. Searl's machine, and I don't know whether the viewers can see this. This is something called a Wimshurst machine.
Which it looks wonderfully sort of Dr. Frankenstein.
That's right, it's what you call it. It's not exactly advanced technology. It perhaps was 100 years ago or so. And it's very Dr. Frankensteinish. What it does, but I'm not allowed to do it because it risks putting all of Pebble Mill off the air for a considerable period of time. All I have to do is turn this handle, and by entirely well understood physical principles, it generates static electricity. generates a very high voltage. And in fact, under dry conditions, you can get lightning-like sparks jumping between these two balls. Now, Mr. Searl's machine, one of the attributes of it was that, in fact, it generated high voltage and crackled and sparked a lot. That's one point. Second point is, if you spin discs rapidly, and I believe that on the trials, Mr. Searls actually spun it with some kind of a motor and got it up to a high speed, I couldn't help remembering a toy I had as a kid. And what I want to demonstrate here is that it's not at all unusual to spin a disc and find that it takes off. Now, I don't know where this is going.
Yeah, it's just hit the roof, yes. It didn't quite get to the moon in 9 hours, but a member of our audience caught it.
Now, what I would feel was that indeed Mr. Searl built a machine that generated high voltages and crackled a lot. Indeed, it caused radio noise, because this would certainly cause a lot of noise on all your gear here at Pebble Mill. And I also believe it probably took off into the air and perhaps disappeared over a hedge into a pond.
How much money would you be prepared to invest in Mr. Searl's invention?
Now?
Yes.
Not a lot.
Well, you
want me to quantify it further than
you're
that?
a bit of a... No, I'll leave you at that at the moment, Dr. Donnelly, because we have somebody on the phone who is prepared to put an awful lot more than that behind it. It's an American businessman called Devon Tasson, who's the president of an American energy company, and I hope he's on the phone now. Hello, Mr. Tasson, are you there?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning to you. I know it's very early in the morning for you. I'm sorry we've got you up, but your company has in fact agreed to back Mr. Searl's invention. What kind of money are you prepared to put up?
Well, I'm pleased to say that Hydrostock Corporation is heavily involved in the development of free energy equipment. And since John's work parallels our work here in the U.S., we may spend as much as $200,000 to $300,000 in the next year developing this work.
So that's getting on for £250,000. Why are you so convinced that it's a good idea?
Yes, knowing that free energy is only possible when we look at the original Newtonian physics and others. But we are not taught the whole picture in our institutions today, so it's hard to find something you're not looking for.
Well, in fact, our scientist here says that this invention breaks all the rules of science. What's your reaction to that?
Well, when we really get an understanding of what is happening, I really don't believe it violates the laws of physics, but we have to really have a full understanding of both. And John's machine, as well as others, I believe functions well within the laws of physics, but with a little different understanding than what we have been taught in our schooling or our institutions.
Mr. Tasson, how soon can we expect to see a prototype, do you think?
Well, we would hope to have a marketable product within 6 to 12 months at this time.
Well, Mr. Tasson, thanks very much for joining us from America. It's very interesting information for us. It's also, I should imagine, John, extremely heartening for you that somebody is prepared to put their money behind your idea. Does that please you?
Well, it does, because recently I've got further news, other products to go ahead, which of course makes me feel much happy. The only sad thing is it's not Britain.
But I mean, does people like Dr. Donnelly's ideas and antagonistic feelings, does that upset you?
Not at the least, I expect it. If I never expected I'd have to worry. He might go and do what I'm doing and win me at the gate.
If we were to come back in 6 months, Dr. Donnelly, and bring John here and bring him with this prototype that Mr. Tasson's going to make, I mean, you know, would you be prepared to change your mind, do you think, then?
Of course. I'll be very happy indeed to eat my words publicly when we have a, I don't know, 3-foot disc hovering off the ground with no means of propulsion.
You see, you're always such a miserable bunch of scientists.
Yeah. I know.
You'll never believe it until it does it in front of you. If we can get his disc to fly in front of you, then you'll believe it.
I'll believe it, and maybe it won't be too late to get a couple of shares in the company at that time. If it were.
Yeah, well, we'll see then. We're not going to be kind to you if you've been awful to us. It'll be very interesting, though, to see if our audience have changed their mind now. What's your reaction, having heard all that? You've heard Dr. Donnelly, a physicist, say it's a load of rubbish. You've heard John's side. You've heard the Americans who are prepared to put perhaps £250,000 into it. Hands up now, those of you who think it's probably more likely than you originally thought. A good 25% of you, which just goes to show that Britishers, like Dr. Donnelly, take an awful lot of convincing. Maybe we'll hear more.